April 8, 1943. 30,000 feet above Conches, France, the thin air bit at exposed skin and turned the world below into a cold, distant dream. Inside the cockpit of a Focke-Wulf 190A5, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermeken let out a sharp laugh through his oxygen mask. His voice, crackling over the radio, carried that familiar confidence, the kind earned through years of combat over Poland, Britain, and Russia. Die Amerikaner schicken uns fliegende Milchflaschen, he said to his wingman. The Americans have sent us flying milk bottles. Below him, 16 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts from the 4th Fighter Group struggled upward like iron whales trying to defy gravity. To Hermeken's trained eyes, they looked absurd. Barrel-chested machines with greenhouse canopies and propellers so large they looked like windmill blades pulled from an old farm. He watched them with a predator's calm. These American fighters were making their combat debut over Europe, and to veterans of Jägerschwader 26, they appeared laughable, clumsy, overweight, an insult to the art of aerial combat. What none of the Germans circling above knew, what none of them could yet fathom, was that these ungainly beasts were not a punchline. They were prophecy. In less than 2 years, the very sight of a P-47 silhouette would send chills down the spine of even the most hardened Luftwaffe ace. Its 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns would write a brutal new chapter in the rulebook of aerial warfare, one not crafted in the finesse of turns and rolls, but in raw power, industrial logic, and annihilating firepower. But on this cold April morning, the ghost had not yet spoken. The thunder had not yet rolled. At the controls of one of those Thunderbolts was Major Donald Blakesley, commanding officer of the 335th Fighter Squadron, a former Eagle Squadron pilot who had flown Spitfires for the RAF before America officially entered the war. Blakesley was a fighter through and through. He had flown the sleek British machines in the Battle of Britain and had felt the knife-edge tension of one-on-one dogfights. Now he sat behind a control stick bolted into nearly 8 tons of American aluminum and steel, climbing toward the most experienced fighter force in the world. If you believe the stories of tanks, troops, and secret missions deserve to be remembered, hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Ghosts of World War II. These aren't just war stories. They're echoes of the past that shaped our world. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a monster, and not by accident. It had been conceived in 1940 under the pressure of panic. With France fallen and Britain barely holding the line, the U.S. Army Air Corps sent a desperate request to Republic Aviation. They needed a high-altitude interceptor, fast. What Alexander Kartveli, Republic's chief designer, delivered was not the nimble, elegant bird of classic dogfighting. It was a brute, a juggernaut. The XP-47B, when it first flew in May 1941, stunned observers. Weighing nearly 10,000 pounds empty, more than some twin-engine bombers, it defied every known fighter design philosophy. The massive turbo-supercharger system looped through the fuselage like intestines. The wings looked stubby, barely capable of lifting such weight. Test pilots called it absurd. One asked, "This thing actually flies?" But fly it did. And not just that, it soared at altitudes where German fighters began to sputter. At 30,000 feet, the P-47's R-2800 double Wasp radial engine delivered full power. While Messerschmitts gasped for oxygen, Thunderbolts thundered past them like rolling freight trains in the sky. The first months of combat were painful lessons. German aces feasted on the new arrivals. The P-47s couldn't turn with the nimble Bf-109s or Fw-190. They were slow to climb, unresponsive in tight maneuvers. The kill ratios were lopsided. British observers sneered. RAF pilots joked that the only evasive maneuver in a Thunderbolt was to unstrap and hide in the back of its cavernous cockpit. But something strange was happening beneath the humiliation. Thunderbolts that returned from combat bore scars, gaping holes from cannon shells, shredded ailerons, and shredded fuselage skins. And yet, they came home. One aircraft limped back with 21 cannon strikes and over 100 machine gun hits. Mechanics stared in disbelief. The engine still ran. The wings held. The pilot lived. The German aces began to notice something too. Their carefully aimed bursts weren't dropping these beasts the way they did Spitfires or Yaks. And when the Thunderbolts fired back, when they caught a Messerschmitt in the jaws of their 8 synchronized Brownings, the result wasn't just a kill. It was obliteration. There was no smoke trail, no slow spiral earthward. There was debris, wings separated, fuselages torn apart. Cockpits vanished in puffs of dust and fire. This was not finesse. This was fury. Then came June 26, 1943. Near Le Touquet, France, 2nd Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron found himself alone and nearly dead. His P-47 had been ambushed by a formation of Focke-Wulfs, and in the opening seconds he took devastating fire. His canopy shattered. The engine cowling was ripped apart. Fire sprayed through the cockpit. Blood trickled from his face and leg. He tried to eject, but a cannon shell had welded the canopy shut. He was trapped in a crippled, burning machine over enemy territory. Then came the impossible. The P-47 refused to die. Johnson leveled the stick. The oil-smeared windscreen gave him no visibility, but the aircraft still responded. Limping toward the channel, the Thunderbolt dragged itself eastward like a wounded animal with unfinished business. Then a lone Focke-Wulf found him. What followed was one of the most chilling encounters in aerial warfare. The German pilot, stunned that Johnson's P-47 was still airborne, opened fire again. Johnson, powerless to evade, sat helpless behind the armor plate. The enemy's cannon shells were gone, but he still had machine guns. He fired again and again. Still, the Thunderbolt flew. Finally, the German pilot pulled alongside. Johnson looked into his face, young, blond, and slowly unraveling. The Luftwaffe ace stared at the battered Thunderbolt. Then, with a shake of his head, he offered a salute and turned away. Johnson made it back. His crew chief stopped counting bullet holes after 200. One shell had detonated inches from his head. Another had blasted the seat armor behind him. Yet the Thunderbolt had flown. When news of Johnson's survival spread, it electrified the 8th Air Force. Engineers dissected the aircraft in awe. German intelligence refused to believe it, but eyewitness testimony from Jagdgeschwader 26 confirmed the truth. This flying milk bottle was a monster in disguise, and the Luftwaffe had a new problem. What the German High Command had underestimated wasn't just the industrial power of the United States, it was the American ability to adapt. The Luftwaffe had expected green American pilots to crumble under fire, relying on inferior machines built for quantity over quality. But by the summer of 1943, that assumption had been shattered. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, once mocked as a flying milk bottle, had begun rewriting the rules of air combat at 30,000 feet. The lessons were hard-learned. American losses in April and May were significant. Thunderbolt groups often took double-digit casualties in early operations. The problem wasn't the machine, but the mindset. American pilots were trained in the turn-and-burn tactics of the Pacific and British styles of dogfighting. The P-47 wasn't made for that. It was a new breed, fast in a dive, tough as armor plate, and terrifyingly destructive if it got its guns on target. It took weeks of blood and loss before squadrons like the 56th and 4th Fighter Groups adapted. But once they did, the skies began to change. Boom and zoom became the doctrine. Instead of engaging in turning fights where the Thunderbolt's weight was a liability, pilots would climb high, 30,000 feet or more, and then dive at incredible speed toward German formations. They would unleash their 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns in a short, concentrated burst and then climb away before the enemy could react. The Germans, used to turning battles, found themselves overwhelmed. Pilots like Gabby Gabreski, Dave Schilling, and Robert Johnson began racking up kills, proving that when used correctly, the P-47 was a deadly predator. Johnson's survival over France wasn't just a story, it was a revelation. After taking over 200 hits from machine guns and 20-millimeter cannon fire, his P-47 somehow made it home. That mission became legend. Engineers studying the wreckage realized the sheer toughness of the airframe. It was overbuilt, yes, but it could take hits that would shatter a Bf-109 or FW-190. German pilots, who had laughed at the American juggernaut, began speaking of it in hushed tones. They gave it nicknames like the Jug and the Flying Tank. And when they heard that low, thunderous roar from above, they knew they were in for hell. By August 1943, the 8th Air Force had begun coordinating long-range bomber raids deep into German-held territory. The P-47's range was a problem. It couldn't escort B-17s and B-24s all the way to targets in places like Regensburg or Schweinfurt. But new external fuel tanks were arriving, 75-gallon belly tanks and 108-gallon wing tanks that extended the Jug's reach by hundreds of miles. With these, Thunderbolt groups could begin meeting bombers deeper into Germany, fending off the increasingly desperate German interceptors. The Germans, for their part, responded with innovation and desperation. Bf-109s were fitted with rocket pods. FW-190s began flying in tighter packs, hoping to overwhelm the escorts. They even deployed the twin-engine Bf-110 and Me-410 destroyer fighters, bristling with heavy cannon to shred bomber formations. But it wasn't enough. In one engagement in September, Thunderbolts dove on a formation of Bf-110s, lining up on a group of B-17. In a matter of seconds, 6 of the German fighters were torn apart mid-air. The rest scattered. The effect was cumulative. Every encounter left German formations smaller. Every returning pilot had another story of Thunderbolts appearing out of nowhere, guns blazing, leaving only smoke and fire behind. And those stories weren't just circulating among the fighter corps. Ground troops began to take notice. Thunderbolts, operating in fighter-bomber roles, were being equipped with bombs and rockets. When they came low over a column of trucks or tanks, destruction followed. A 2-second burst could turn a Panzer into a burning wreck. Rockets, each as powerful as a 105-millimeter artillery shell, cratered roads and sent shockwaves through entire battalions. German soldiers began calling them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber. But these weren't just attack aircraft. They were still fighters, still interceptors, and they still owned the air. German morale, already strained by losses in Russia and North Africa, began to crumble under the pressure of constant, unrelenting aerial assault. Units refused to move during the day. Supply convoys were decimated. Ammunition dumps went up in smoke. And above it all, the distant rumble of P-47s became an omen of death. In the interrogation rooms at Oberursel, captured German pilots began telling a different story. No longer dismissing the Thunderbolt, they described it with something approaching awe. One pilot, debriefed in October 1943, said simply, "We cannot fight these aircraft. We cannot catch them, and we cannot stop them. Their guns destroy us before we can react." American intelligence, reviewing these reports, realized that for the first time, fear had entered the minds of the Luftwaffe's best. The air war was shifting, but it wasn't just because of better tactics or better machines. It was the training, the scale, the relentlessness. American pilots were better prepared. They flew more hours. They had more fuel, more ammunition, better maintenance. German pilots, by contrast, were being rushed to the front with fewer hours, older aircraft, and less support. And every Thunderbolt in the air represented an entire industrial machine working around the clock to support it. By November, the Luftwaffe began to change its strategy. Instead of dogfighting, they focused on high-speed, head-on passes at bomber formations, hoping to punch through the escort screen. But even this was suicidal. The Thunderbolt's sheer speed in a dive allowed it to intercept before the German formations could set up. The skies were no longer contested. They were owned. And yet, the Thunderbolt story was just beginning. New variants were on the way, faster, more powerful, with paddle blade propellers that improved climb rate and acceleration dramatically. The Germans, running out of experienced pilots and facing increasing fuel shortages, could only watch as the jug grew stronger. But perhaps the most telling detail wasn't technical or tactical. It was emotional. In post-war interviews, German pilots spoke of the Thunderbolt not just as a weapon, but as a symbol. It was the sound of inevitability, the growl that preceded destruction, the American ghost in the sky that arrived without warning, hit with hurricane force, and vanished before anyone could fire back. In the fields of France, in the skies over Belgium, over the frozen forests of the Ardennes and the smoke-choked ruins of the Ruhr, the Thunderbolt came again and again. And with every pass, it whispered the same message into the ears of every German soldier: "We are here. You cannot stop us." By early 1944, the transformation was complete. What began as a bulky, misunderstood fighter had evolved into a dominant force across the skies of Europe. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, with its rugged frame, deafening roar, and thunderous guns, had become the symbol of unstoppable Allied airpower. But it was the D-22 and D-25 variants, equipped with paddle blade propellers and upgraded turbochargers, that cemented the Thunderbolt's reputation as an apex predator in the air war over the continent. These changes weren't cosmetic. The paddle blade propellers allowed the P-47 to claw into the sky with greater efficiency, drastically improving its climb rate. Earlier models struggled to gain altitude quickly, a serious liability when dogfighting against nimble German interceptors like the Bf-109G or FW-190A. But with the new props, the Jug could match or exceed the climb performance of many Luftwaffe fighters. Combined with its superior dive speed, this gave American pilots total control over when and how to fight. And the Germans noticed. Pilots who once laughed at the Thunderbolt now found themselves fleeing from it. Combat reports from early 1944 began to show a shift. German fighters were actively avoiding engagements with Thunderbolts, particularly at high altitude. What was once a lumbering curiosity had become the hunter. Luftwaffe commanders even issued new directives, warning pilots against engaging P-47s, unless they held altitude and numerical superiority. By March 1944, Thunderbolt squadrons could escort bombers deep into the heart of Germany. Extended-range drop tanks had become standard, turning what had once been a tactical escort into a strategic nightmare for the German defense network. Now formations of B-17 and B-24s weren't alone after crossing the Rhine. They had an ever-present wall of American firepower alongside them, thundering above the clouds. And when the enemy came, the Thunderbolts were waiting. In one mission over Berlin in March 1944, a flight of P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group engaged over 50 German aircraft, attempting to reach the bomber stream. The result was devastating. Using coordinated boom and zoom tactics, the Thunderbolts broke up the attack, before it reached the bombers. In less than 15 minutes, 15 German aircraft had been destroyed with minimal Allied losses. Gun camera footage showed the horrifying precision of American gunnery, converging bursts from 8.50 caliber Brownings slicing aircraft in half mid-flight. And that terrifying sound, the synchronized firing of 8 machine guns, each spitting rounds at 1,200 feet per second, became known as Roosevelt's piano among American pilots. To the Germans, it was the thunderclap of doom, an unmistakable auditory warning that death was moments away. Ground troops reported hearing the sound before they even saw the aircraft. It was the overture to destruction. The Thunderbolt's transition into a fighter-bomber further changed the dynamics of the European battlefield. No longer just an escort fighter, it now carried up to 2,500 pounds of bombs and 10 5-inch rockets, more than many medium bombers of just a few years earlier. With these, P-47s laid waste to railways, bridges, convoys, airfields, and armor concentrations. German logistics, already strained by years of war and limited fuel, were now under constant threat from the sky. In Normandy, P-47s flew over 5,000 missions in the first week of the invasion alone. German reinforcements were cut off, panzer divisions immobilized, and command posts obliterated, all by Thunderbolts prowling just above the hedgerows. One Wehrmacht officer, interviewed after capture, said simply, "We moved by night, but even then we feared them. They could smell fuel. One spark and your entire column vanished." These were not isolated incidents. They were systemic annihilations. The 9th Air Force's P-47s claimed over 650 locomotives, nearly 4,000 trucks, and over 500 tanks in June 1944 alone. Bridges that took months to build were destroyed in a single pass. Ammunition convoys disappeared in fireballs. The Luftwaffe, attempting to support their ground forces, found themselves decimated in every encounter. By the time of Operation Market Garden in September 1944, Thunderbolts were performing coordinated interdiction with pinpoint accuracy. Flying in pairs and triplets, they destroyed German columns before they could reach Arnhem. Their rockets, fired in salvo, hit with the force of artillery shells. Their machine guns, loaded with armor-piercing incendiaries, shredded vehicles, fuel trucks, and bunkers. One P-47 pilot described the scene. "You'd see a line of trucks, just like ants on a road. You'd dive, fire a 3-second burst, and the whole road would erupt. Nothing survived, not even the trees. Even elite German tank units feared the jug." The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, veterans of the Eastern Front, found themselves pinned in daylight, unable to move for fear of air attack. Reports noted dozens of Panther and Tiger tanks, destroyed or abandoned due to damage from Thunderbolt attacks, many from machine gun fire igniting external fuel and ammunition stowage. By late 1944, the psychological impact of the Thunderbolt was unignorable. German pilots developed Jabo fever, a form of acute stress triggered by hearing or seeing fighter bombers. Morale collapsed. Luftwaffe command centers received constant complaints from frontline units. "Where is our air cover? How can we move under these conditions?" One German officer described it bitterly. "We hold the ground only at night. By day, the Americans own everything." But even with their dominance, P-47 pilots never took their advantage for granted. Every mission carried risk. The Luftwaffe, though diminished, still had sharp teeth. Flak was a constant danger. Fuel shortages sometimes meant Thunderbolt pilots had to glide home on fumes, and in the final months of the war, Germany began deploying its most advanced weapon yet, the Me-262 jet fighter. Faster than anything the Allies could field, the Me-262 could outrun any propeller-driven aircraft, but P-47 pilots adapted. They caught jets during takeoff or landing, when the turbojets were still spooling, or when the aircraft was low and slow. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer scored one of the first jet kills in history, diving from altitude in a Thunderbolt and catching the Me-262 in level flight. His gun spoke. The jet disintegrated. Such victories were hard won, but they confirmed what the Thunderbolt had come to represent: adaptability, resilience, and dominance. It wasn't the fastest or the sleekest, but it was the most feared. The P-47 wasn't just an aircraft, it was a force of nature. German General Adolf Galland, interviewed after the war, put it plainly: "We underestimated the Americans. We saw the P-47 and laughed, but the laugh died quickly. It could dive like lightning, it could climb like smoke, and when it fired, God help you, you weren't damaged, you were destroyed." And that was the legacy of the Thunderbolt by the close of 1944. Not just victories in the air, not just cities and bridges left in ruin, but a legacy etched into the minds of every German soldier who had seen the sky darken with wings and heard the roar of Roosevelt's piano. By early 1945, the once mighty Luftwaffe had become a shadow of its former self. German fuel stocks were critically low, experienced pilots were gone, and airfields across the Reich were pocked with craters from relentless Allied bombing. Yet still, the P-47 Thunderbolt flew, unstoppable, unrelenting, and unmatched. It had evolved into a symbol not just of firepower, but of inevitability. And now, with victory in sight, the Jug would hammer the final nails into the coffin of Nazi Germany's aerial hopes. The introduction of the P-47M in January 1945 marked the ultimate refinement of the Thunderbolt's design. Built specifically to intercept German jets and V-1 flying bombs, the M model boasted water methanol injection, pushing its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine to a staggering 2,800 horsepower. It could reach 470 miles per hour in level flight at 30,000 feet, speeds that put it within striking distance of even the vaunted Messerschmitt Me-262. For a radial engine, propeller-driven aircraft, it was nothing short of miraculous. German pilots who once relied on speed to escape were now being hunted down. And if the Thunderbolt couldn't catch a jet in a straight line, it would wait, near airfields, near runways, near fuel depots. The moment those jets slowed for landing or takeoff, the P-47s pounced. In one mission alone, Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group destroyed 6 Me-262s as they attempted to land at Rhine-Hopsten airfield. The German advantage in speed was real, but brief. Their vulnerability in transition was fatal. By the spring of 1945, Luftwaffe Command admitted in internal memoranda that continued fighter operations were untenable under current conditions. These weren't just logistical limitations, they were psychological defeats. Pilots refused missions. Morale collapsed. Every engagement meant flying into the teeth of American firepower. If they rose to meet the bombers, Thunderbolts were there, waiting. If they stayed on the ground, they were bombed. The Reich had lost air superiority in every meaningful way. Ground attack missions became the Thunderbolt's domain. With the Luftwaffe paralyzed, P-47s flew low and fast, tearing into enemy convoys, destroying bridges, and leveling rail yards with impunity. During Operation Varsity, the Allied airborne assault across the Rhine in March 1945, P-47s supported paratroopers with surgical strikes. They obliterated flak batteries before they could fire, strafed advancing infantry, and cut down German counterattacks before they could form. One British officer observed, "Our boys wouldn't be alive if not for those bloody Thunderbolts. They broke the Wehrmacht before they ever reached us." And while the air war raged over Europe, the P-47 was writing a second legend in the Pacific. The P-47N, developed specifically for long-range escort in the Pacific theater, featured extended wings and internal fuel tanks capable of holding 360 gallons, nearly double the capacity of earlier models. With additional drop tanks, it could reach a range of 2,350 miles. This brought the Thunderbolt into the heart of Japan's defensive sphere. No longer just a European menace, it now escorted B-29 superfortresses deep into enemy territory, all the way to the home islands. The 318th Fighter Group, operating from Saipan, Guam, and Ieshima, employed P-47s in long-range bomber escort, air superiority, and ground attack missions. In July 1945, they attacked Japanese convoys near Kyushu with rockets and bombs, sinking multiple ships and destroying port facilities. Japanese aircraft scrambled to defend their homeland, but the P-47s were waiting. One mission report recorded the destruction of 15 enemy fighters, with no Thunderbolt losses. Japanese pilots, used to fighting lightly armored American aircraft like the P-40 or F-4F, found the P-47 nearly invincible. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace, later described his encounter. "I hit it with 20mm shells, direct hits, but it flew on. I could not understand. Then it turned, and I saw the fire from its wings. It was not a fighter. It was a machine of death." From New Guinea to the Philippines, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa, the Thunderbolt became the dreadnought of the Pacific skies. Even kamikaze airfields were not safe. In April 1945, Thunderbolts from the 318th bombed suicide plane stockpiles on Kyushu, destroying dozens of aircraft on the ground before they could ever be launched. The Japanese had no answer. Their aging aircraft crumbled under the weight of American bullets. Their infrastructure shattered. Their pilots died before ever seeing the enemy. And behind every kill was a supply chain without equal. While Germany's war machine starved, America's industrial complex fed the jug with everything it needed. The Farmingdale plant on Long Island and the massive Evansville facility in Indiana were producing hundreds of P-47s each month. Crates of parts arrived by the thousands: propellers, wings, engines, electrical harnesses. Mechanics, many of whom had never touched an aircraft before the war, were trained in weeks and kept these monsters flying under the harshest combat conditions. Each Thunderbolt contained over 8 miles of wiring, 65,000 individual components, and an engine more complex than most locomotives. Yet they rolled off assembly lines with breathtaking speed. Pilots would lose one aircraft in France, be assigned a new one in England, and be back in the air the next day. Losses were replaced not by exception, but by design. Ammunition alone was a marvel. Each .5 caliber round, precision machined, chemically treated, and loaded with a mix of armor-piercing and incendiary compounds, burned hotter than magnesium. The Lake City arsenal produced 30 million rounds per month to feed the jug. That volume of fire gave pilots something no other Air Force had: the ability to sustain suppression. German pilots had 20 seconds of cannon fire. Thunderbolt pilots had 30 seconds of hell. And while numbers told one story, the human element told another. American pilots entered combat with over 400 hours of flight time. By war's end, German pilots had less than 100 hours total. That experience gap was fatal. Thunderbolt pilots knew formation tactics, navigation, gunnery, radio discipline. They flew against captured enemy aircraft in training, learned enemy weaknesses from film, and understood that teamwork, not individual dogfighting prowess, won battles. Where Luftwaffe veterans were replaced by hastily trained teenagers, the U.S. kept pouring trained killers into the sky. This disparity came to a head on January 1st, 1945, during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's last desperate attempt to cripple Allied air power on the ground. Nearly 1,000 German fighters launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields in the Low Countries. At Y-34 airfield near Metz, Thunderbolts were caught refueling and rearming. 22 P-47s were destroyed on the ground. But by dusk, American logistics had already begun sweeping debris and flying in replacements. Within 48 hours, new aircraft from England had replaced every loss. Meanwhile, Germany lost over 270 fighters and 200 experienced pilots in that single day, losses they could never replace. Thunderbolt units resumed normal operations by January 3rd. The Luftwaffe never did. This was the power of the P-47, not just as an aircraft, but as a system. A machine fed by infinite supply, flown by well-trained men, and backed by a nation that could outproduce, outfuel, and outfight any enemy on Earth. By the final months of the war, German units began surrendering en masse, not just to infantry, but to the sky itself. Reports from the Rhineland noted German columns pulling white sheets over their vehicles at the first sight of Thunderbolts. Entire units abandoned armored vehicles intact, unwilling to risk the inevitable strafing runs that followed. And then came the ultimate test, confronting the myth of superiority. At the Allied Interrogation Center in Oberursel, German fighter pilots were debriefed after capture. Time and again, the Thunderbolt came up. Unkillable, they said. It flies through fire. You can't shoot it down. You can only run. Even Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's most respected fighter commander, conceded its dominance after the war. We underestimated the Americans. They built a flying fortress and called it a fighter. But it worked. It worked better than we imagined. The Thunderbolt didn't just beat the Luftwaffe. It shattered the illusion of invincibility that had cloaked Germany's Air Force since 1939. And it did so with noise, with bullets, and with the unshakable rhythm of 8 synchronized guns hammering out the death knell of Nazi air power. As the Allies closed in on Berlin, the P-47's role expanded beyond destruction. It became an airborne presence, an angel to Allied ground forces, and a specter of death to the retreating Wehrmacht. With air superiority a foregone conclusion, Thunderbolts took to the skies with a freedom no German aircraft could match. They loitered for hours, picking targets at will, responding to frontline calls, and vanishing back into the clouds before enemy eyes could adjust. In April 1945, a single P-47 flight from the 362nd Fighter Group was credited with halting an entire German battalion trying to escape across the Elbe River. Flying in relays, 4 Thunderbolts rotated low-level strafing runs over the narrow crossing, destroying trucks, wagons, boats, and anything that moved. After 5 hours of continuous attack, over 300 German soldiers surrendered to advancing U.S. infantry without firing a shot. One officer reportedly said, "We weren't beaten by tanks. We were beaten by the sky." Ground troops came to revere the Thunderbolt not just as a weapon, but as a protector. Stories circulated in every division of a lone P-47 saving an ambushed convoy, of a pilot circling a pinned-down platoon for hours, of gunfire from above clearing a path when none existed on the ground. Soldiers carved P-47s into the handles of their rifles. Some painted them onto helmets. Others swore they could hear the jugs even before they appeared. That low thunder that meant someone up there was on your side. In the Pacific, the same devotion grew. P-47Ns flying from Iwo Jima and Okinawa performed long-range escort and attack missions deep into Japanese territory. As kamikaze attacks intensified, Thunderbolts were tasked with patrolling near the home islands, intercepting suicide planes before they could reach the fleet. The P-47's firepower was uniquely suited to this role. Kamikazes were fragile, and even a single hit from a .50 caliber could shatter their wooden frames. But the Thunderbolt didn't deal in single hits. It dealt in overkill. Naval reports noted dozens of kamikaze kills by P-47s during the Battle of Okinawa. In one case, a Thunderbolt shot down a suicide plane less than 100 feet from the USS New Mexico. The flaming wreckage slammed into the sea harmlessly, and the battleship's crew erupted into cheers. The pilot, Lieutenant Harold McClure, was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. But when asked about it later, he simply said, "I didn't do anything special. I just pulled the trigger and let the jugs do what they do. And what they did, more than anything, was endure." The P-47 didn't just survive hits, it survived campaigns. Pilots grew attached to their aircraft in ways seldom seen. Some flew the same machine across 100 missions, decorating the fuselage with kill marks, bomb icons, even playing cards and pin-up girls. One pilot, Captain Henry Hank Landry of the 56th Fighter Group, named his Thunderbolt Widowmaker, not for its danger to pilots, but to its enemies. Landry flew it from D-Day through to the Rhine crossings, surviving 4 crash landings, 2 mid-air collisions, and 1 emergency belly landing on a frozen lake. "She never gave up," he said in a post-war interview, "even when I did." Stories like these filled the journals, interviews, and reunion halls of the post-war years. Veterans remembered their aircraft not just as tools, but as comrades. There was a sense that the Jug had a will of its own, stubborn, unyielding, American. And that identity became part of its mystique. German pilots spoke of the fat ones with dread. Japanese pilots called them the Silver Monsters. Allied troops just called them saviors. But perhaps the most remarkable story of all was what came after. With victory declared, thousands of Thunderbolts returned to American soil. Some were scrapped, some sold to allies. But a few were preserved, put on display in museums or tucked into hangars by proud squadrons who knew what they had been part of. Today, those survivors speak in silence. They don't fly, they don't fire, but they remain. One such P-47D sits at the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center. Cleaned, polished, and pristine, it lacks the scars of battle, but not the history. Its 8.50 caliber Brownings are intact. Its propeller, still bearing chipped paint from training missions, is locked in place. Visitors pass by every day, often unaware of what this hulking machine meant to a generation of warriors. But for those who know, for the veterans, the historians, the sons and daughters of those who flew them, the Jug is no relic. It's a monument to a philosophy. That victory doesn't belong to the sleekest design or the flashiest machine. It belongs to what works, what lasts, what shows up mission after mission and does the job, no matter how ugly, how dirty, or how dangerous. The Thunderbolt wasn't the most beautiful aircraft of the war. It didn't inspire poems like the Spitfire or ballads like the Mustang. But in the skies over Europe, in the jungles of the Pacific, and across every battlefield from 1943 to 1945, it was the aircraft pilots trusted most, because it brought them home. That trust was earned in aluminum and fire. Ask any surviving pilot what they felt when they saw tracers rise toward them, or flak explode around their wings, or a German 190 try to cut in from behind, and they'll tell you. They trusted the Jug. It was heavy. It was loud. It couldn't always outturn or outclimb the enemy. But it could dive. It could hit. And it could take a beating like no fighter before or since. By war's end, Thunderbolts had destroyed more than 10,000 enemy aircraft. They had bombed trains, tanks, trucks, bridges, airfields, and bunkers. They had flown more combat sorties than any other U.S. aircraft in the European theater. And they had earned their place, not just in history books, but in the hearts of those who lived to tell their stories. At a reunion of the 9th Air Force in 1984, a former German pilot attended as a guest. He stood beside one of the restored P-47s and placed his hand on its flank. "I flew against these," he said quietly. "I never laughed at them. Not after 1943. We had a saying. If you see one, maybe you live. If you see 4, maybe not. If you see 8, write to your mother." That was the reputation the Jug earned, not just as a machine of war, but as a legend. And in the skies where it once roared, in the stories passed down from generation to generation, in the museums where it now rests with silent pride, the Thunderbolt still flies. It flies in memory, in legacy, and in every ghostly echo of machine gun fire that once silenced the arrogant and defended the free. Because the ghosts who flew the P-47 didn't fade. They thundered into history, and they never looked back. As the guns of Europe and the Pacific finally fell silent in 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt, once mocked, once doubted, stood among the quiet giants of victory. Its engine, once thundering across the skies in violent crescendos of destruction, now idled in the hangars of peace. But what it left behind was far louder than any roar it ever made. It left a legacy written in smoke trails and scorched steel, in wrecked rail yards and shattered armor, in the silence that followed its guns. The war was over, but the ghosts remained. For the pilots who flew them, the Jug was more than a machine. It was a constant in a world that changed by the second. When friends were shot down, when skies erupted with fire, when death circled like a vulture, there was the Jug, reliable, brutal, honest. It didn't promise elegance, but it delivered survival. It didn't outshine its enemies with acrobatics, but it outlasted them, outgunned them, and outflew them when it mattered most. These men, boys really, many barely out of high school, climbed into cockpits knowing that each takeoff might be their last. They knew the odds. They knew the names of the pilots who hadn't come back. And still, they strapped in. Because they had something that gave them a fighting chance, a machine that could take more damage, carry more firepower, and protect them like no other. You can read the mission reports. You can count the victories. But you cannot measure the bond between a man and the machine that carried him through hell. Lieutenant George Patton, no relation to the general, a 21-year-old pilot from Ohio, wrote home after his 50th mission. "I've seen her wings full of holes, oil pressure dropping, fuel leaking, controls sluggish, but she always brought me home. I don't know how she does it. Maybe she's haunted. Maybe the ghosts of my friends fly with me. Maybe they did. Because something about the P-47 went beyond rivets and armor plating. There was a spirit in those wings, born not just from the engineers at Republic Aviation, but from the welders in Indiana, the riveters in Long Island, the riveters who worked double shifts to keep them coming, from the truck drivers who hauled the fuel, from the quartermasters who loaded the guns, from a nation that believed in overwhelming effort, in mass production not as excess, but as the price of freedom. That spirit became the ghost in the Jug, and long after the last mission, that spirit endured. In the 1950s, when surplus Thunderbolts were sold or scrapped, some pilots paid out of pocket to preserve them. Others searched junkyards to find their old birds, now weathered and forgotten, and restored them with their own hands. They taught their sons to polish the aluminum. They ran their fingers along the fuselage, remembering the way the cockpit smelled of cordite and oil, the way their gloves gripped the stick in icy European dawns, the way the 8 Brownings kicked like a heartbeat when the trigger was pulled. Not every ghost wore a uniform. The families of pilots who never came home kept the memory alive. They told stories around kitchen tables, showed faded photographs, passed down medals, logbooks, and letters written in nervous hands before a mission. They visited the museums where P-47s now stand silent and placed trembling hands on cold steel, imagining what it sounded like at full throttle, what it felt like to be inside when the world below was fire. And in those moments, the jug still flew. Every thunderclap in the sky, every engine that rattled windows like a growl from the heavens, every old man who looked up and said, "That sounds like a Pratt and Whitney." The ghosts stirred, not to haunt, but to remind us what was built, what was risked, what was lost, and what was won. Because the legacy of the Thunderbolt is not just that it was powerful, or fast, or deadly. It's that it was dependable when everything else was chaos. That it saved lives not by elegance, but by stubborn refusal to die. That it taught the world a lesson the Luftwaffe learned too late. Underestimate it, and it will end you. Today, there are few left who flew the jug in combat. Most are gone, their stories recorded on tape, in books, in the memories of those who listened. But the machines remain, in museums, in hangars, in air shows, where their engines rumble to life and the past returns for a few precious minutes. When the propeller spins and the canopy locks, and the old bird takes to the air once more, it carries more than just a pilot. It carries history. It carries ghosts. At the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, one Thunderbolt bears a message scrawled in pencil beneath the cockpit, a quote found in a pilot's diary recovered from a downed jug in France. "She was ugly. She was heavy. She wouldn't dance, but she would fight, and she would die before she let me go down alone." That's the Thunderbolt. That's the spirit of the men who flew her. And that's why we remember. So let the Spitfires have their poetry. Let the Mustangs have their fame. The jug was never about beauty. It was about strength. It was about grit. It was about the sound that meant hope to the men on the ground and fear to those who faced it in the sky. The sound of justice. The sound of vengeance. The sound of American steel, thundering across the sky with 8 Brownings blazing and a mission to fulfill. This is the ghost in the machine, the echo of those who flew, fought, and fell. This is the legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt. And for those who remember, for those who listen carefully when the clouds rumble and the wind carries a sound that doesn't quite belong to now, the jug still flies. If this story hit you like it did us, hit like, subscribe to Ghosts of World War II, and drop the word Thunder Wraith in the comments, our tribute to the unbreakable spirits who turned steel into legend.